In 2019, the current mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, gave the go-ahead for a scheme originally proposed by the Conservative mayor, Boris Johnson. This was a scheme that was proposed by the Conservative Party and then approved and executed by Labour. You may be asking, what utopian project could have been so unilaterally supported that both opposing forces in UK politics encouraged its implementation? The ultra-low emission zone was a concept that promised to rid London of its lethal levels of nitrogen monoxide and dioxide pollution. It was absolutely necessary that the City of London did this because the levels of pollution London was experiencing became the subject of international scrutiny. Illegal levels of pollutants were being measured across the capital and far into the residential outskirts, and something had to be done. You may be wondering, what is so bad about these particular pollutants? After all, it isn't carbon particulates, which is essentially smoke. It isn't carbon monoxide, which is the big scary gas we all know about, and it isn't carbon dioxide, which we know causes an excess buildup in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, contributing to global warming. What NOx gases do impact is the long-term health of human beings and animals. If you're an asthmatic like me, you will easily be able to tell the difference between fresh air and NOx-infested air, depending on whether you start wheezing or not. Though if you are perfectly healthy, you may not notice any change at all. Your children, however, are likely to experience a higher likelihood of developing respiratory and pulmonary health issues, such as asthma, compared to their peers. So it stands to reason that as an asthmatic, I was initially overjoyed at the prospect of finally being able to breathe when I go outside, and that something was finally being done to combat the rise of asthma in children. This, however, all changed when ULEZ was actually implemented. Initially, the proposed area would have been Zone 1 Central London within the Ring Road, same as the congestion charge zone. This was nowhere near a large enough area to have any significant impact on air quality, and so an expansion was planned to extend up to the north and south circular ring roads. Most people can agree that is an acceptable point to end the ULEZ zone, as most journeys within this area can and should be done via public transport or bicycle anyway. But even still, this does not rule out every use case of owning a car. Before I talk about that, let's discuss what the restrictions on the ULEZ are. Motorcycles older than Euro 3 are subject to the charge, unless you obtain a certificate of conformity proving your specific example passes the standard. You are allowed to modify your bike to meet the standard, though for bikes it isn't too difficult to obtain a compliant example anyway. Even if your bike's model has been proven to meet the standard from the manufacturer, TfL still refuse to automatically update their database unless you yourself go out of your way to obtain your very own COC certificate and present it to them, even though the result will be exactly the same. Why TfL would choose to include such an insignificantly small portion of road traffic is unclear when taken on its own. But anyway, moving on to cars and vans. Most petrol vehicles older than Euro 4 are subject to the charge. However, some late Euro 3 vehicles are actually exempt and can be picked up at bargain prices. This has led to the unfortunate loss of many previously economic vehicles in favor of more expensive and potentially expensive to own vehicles. For example, my first car was originally supposed to be a forest green 90s Nissan Micra, gifted to me by my uncle. Micras aren't especially my favorite vehicle of choice, but it's impossible to deny the cheap ownership costs associated with them, and so I was more than willing to accept it. After all, I needed a car. I had my own motorcycle for personal use, but I needed to fulfill a promise I made to my grandparents when I was in need of a license. The deal was that they pay for my lessons and I will drive them wherever they want to go, whenever. Some of you may be thinking, well, just use public transport, take a cab, and my response is you have absolutely zero idea what it's like to have limited mobility. A cab is extortionately expensive and public transport is still incredibly limiting to those who are unable to walk easily. At the time, my granddad's health was rapidly deteriorating, and this was towards the start of the downfall of the NHS at the time. It would take over an hour to wait for an ambulance, so we deemed it necessary to always have someone on standby, ready to make the journey if needed. So as you can imagine, owning a cheap and cheerful Nissan Micra would have made me absolutely ecstatic despite my apathy to the car itself. However, the rigidity of ULEZ does not account for circumstances such as mine, and so I had to find other ways of providing cheap and effective transport for my family. Due to my limited budget of £1,000, my options were limited to only 3 models that I could actually insure due to my age, occupation, location, and experience. First was the VW Polo 1.2, which was notorious for having terminal cam chain issues. The second was the Citroen C1, which we did actually take a look at a few extra ropey examples, but in the end decided a blown head gasket on each of them was not worth the hassle. Finally, we settled on old Volvos. Now, unfortunately, all the more reliable, economical, low-tax, low insurance models were all diesel and therefore didn't meet the stringent Euro 6 requirements for ULEZ, so my only options were all high-tax, uneconomical, higher insurance petrols. As such, I had to settle for a 2-litre turbo S60. This not only meant high fuel consumption and high tax, but also due to the high CO2 output was also extremely expensive to park, so me and my family had to come up with various creative ways of dodging the ticket officer the entire 2 years I've owned it. Unfortunately, my granddad passed away before being able to experience the return on his investment in me. but this car has taken me and most of my family and friends anywhere we've needed to go, no matter how far across the country. It was far more expensive than it could have been pre-ULEZ, but I do not believe for a single second that any of the amazing times I've had could have been possible without the car. Now, I could have been a horrible grandson and just used the money I'd saved up to leave London and the sinking ship of a country for good, and have been far happier, healthier, and wealthier, but I don't believe we should allow poorly executed decisions made by disconnected politicians to cause us to make decisions like that, no matter how hard they try. This brings me to the proposed expansion. Right now, the current mayor is planning to go ahead with expanding the ULEZ border all the way out to the edge of Greater London itself. The image in your head of London is probably cramped streets, standstill traffic, and efficient public transport. However, London isn't all like that. Remember that areas such as Bexley, Chessington, and Havering all reside within the ULEZ expansion zone. These are areas that lack the same level of public transport and cycling infrastructure needed to support a migration away from cars, not to mention the sheer number of journeys to and from these areas from outside of London. You wouldn't even be safe from the charge if you don't live here. Now, I do believe that an expansion to this extent is necessary, and I would go as far to say it should be extended to and including the M25 eventually. The problem is timing and execution. We are going through one of the toughest times in this country's history right now. We're an island actively trying to cut ties with our allies. We have a government in conflict with its own people. We are funding a war we cannot afford, selling our natural gas to other countries but restricting it from our own citizens. And to top it all off, corporations are still posting record profits, but it's your fault for crashing the economy because you wanted to feed your children. People are being absolutely screwed in this economy, and it is nothing short of a miracle we haven't erupted into civil war. We cannot afford this right now. If you believe that all car owners are rich and can afford the hit, remember, many of us are on universal credit or working minimum wage 0-hour contract jobs. We also have bills to pay. You're probably wealthier than many of us since you don't need a car. Many car owners don't need a car, granted, but those tend to be from wealthier backgrounds, as their car is a choice, not a necessity. For those drivers, the choice will be simple. They can move out of London or trade up to a ULEZ compliant vehicle. They will not give up their vehicles just because of this policy. They may have even had a more economical car beforehand, seen the recent scrappage scheme as an opportunity to invest in a brand new diesel V8. For those of us who are struggling and actually need their car, this will be crippling. The price of ULEZ compliant cars will rise, and non-compliant cars will fall or be scrapped. If you live outside the zone, I highly recommend you save some of these absolute bargains from the scrapper, as they'll be ridiculously cheap to own. Taking the perfectly functional car off the road and creating a whole new car in its place is incredibly environmentally irresponsible. Volvo did a study of its own on their own EV investments and discovered that an EV only becomes less damaging to the atmosphere well north of 100,000 miles. Most people get rid of their cars well before that, so why is there no emphasis on retrofitting older cars in order to either bring them up to standard or do a full conversion to electricity? Someone should really keep an eye on where these politicians get their money from. Sadiq Khan and Boris Johnson are no saints, I suspect. Well, we always knew about that nonsense, but you know what I'm saying. If you're wondering how it's going to be charged, I have further bad news. The charge is £12.50 per day for each day that you are confirmed in the zone by a camera ping until another camera confirms your exit. TfL does not wish to do anything conveniently or apparently even ethically, because this is not automatically charged or billed to you. Instead, you have to remember to pay it and then pay it in time to avoid a hefty £90 fine, which then escalates to £180 if you cannot pay the original fine within 14 days. Yes, I refuse to refer to fines like this as discounted within a certain period, because unlike the authorities and agencies who enforce this stuff, I don't despise other poor people. Everything I have discussed in this video has led me to one horrifying but well-known conclusion. From the nitpicky inclusion of bikes into the scheme, the refusal to acknowledge and update bikes that are proven exempt automatically on their system, the tone-deaf timing, and the lack of incentivizing modifications to older vehicles to make them exempt and promoting new car ownership, it all appears to just be one big scam. On top of that, once all the infrastructure has been paid for and installed, there's absolutely nothing stopping any future mayor from moving the goalposts on what is and isn't ULEZ compliant. There's absolutely nothing preventing them from making that change at the wrong time, or even deliberately choosing the worst moment possible to cause the most disruption. I voted for Sadiq Khan and I agreed with his policies, including this one. However, even I can't argue that has been executed in possibly one of the worst ways it could have been. If the goal was to force civil disobedience, it seemed to have worked. Local councils such as Hillingdon, Harrow, Bexley and Croydon have decided this is where they draw the line, and have begun to take action against TfL to prevent ULEZ from being implemented in their councils. Local residents have also had enough. TikTok is littered with videos of locals pushing LTN and ULEZ cameras away from the road, or even spray painting over them. There are even examples of locals covering their license plates while entering zones enforced by cameras on Ogmius's TikTok channel. This is what happens when politicians come up with policies without considering the reality of the everyman. Either people are living comfortably enough to accept inconveniences like this to their lives, or they aren't and they won't. And thanks in most part to the Tory government, people are not willing to put up with this. You were warned multiple multiple times in history not to squeeze the poor for more than you could take, but you did not heed that warning. I will not be affected by this latest change. I got out ahead and adapted to the changing tides, but most people will not be so lucky. My advice to those affected is get out ahead as far as you can, but still write to your MPs because they really are this oblivious to how the people are feeling. This has proven that they cannot, in fact, read the room, no matter how good their policies initially seem to be. Now, I don't normally make rants, but I do plan on increasing the amount of scripted videos I make. My GoPro is broken and I can't really afford a replacement at this time. To be fair, I do like making these videos as it gives me the chance to write and get my thoughts in order. I'm not the best at improvising on scene or the most confident in front of the camera. If you do want to see more, hit subscribe and like the video. Comment your thoughts on this policy. As someone who's left-leaning, this has really tested my political leanings and frustrated me massively, so I want to know what you make of all this. Anyway, see you in the next one.